Welcome to the Upfront Podcast, where you get your weekly dose of upfront discussions with people from all around the world. On today's episode, my guest is an intriguing one. He's a very well-known journalist that reports on extremism and war from within. Due to his very dangerous occupation and his covert travels to certain places, we are protecting his identity by using the pseudonym K instead of his real name. That is also the reason why I can't give you any more details on him. We will be talking about insights from a war correspondent's perspective, who has witnessed and experienced war in Syria and other places, firsthand on the ground, as well as the current threat level of terrorism and extremism. This is a content warning. Please be aware that this episode contains topics that some listeners may find difficult to listen to. Listener discretion is advised. So you're a reporter on war situations and extremism. Can you tell me what people that are not in this line of work are maybe not aware of that you have witnessed or experienced?
Well, this job is kind of frustrating, and it's also frustrating because of the internet. It makes it much easier for governments, for authorities to find you, to find out who you are, what you do, and because especially authoritarian governments, they don't like your reporting. Let's say Turkey or Syria or other Arab states, they make your life difficult. They don't allow you to enter their countries. They cause you trouble. They might arrest you. They might take away your equipment. So the internet has some great advantages, of course, for war reporters and for other reporters as well. But it also helps authoritarian governments to track you down.
Yeah, I bet that is a terrifying feeling of you being practically wanted, especially by a government who has a lot more resources to get into looking you up or finding out whether you're entering the country. How do you protect yourself, like whilst you're reporting on war in the midst of it? How do you do that?
Well, it's not so easy. I have several passports, and of course, I try to protect my computer, my iPhone, my whatever I use as a means of communications. As a standalone reporter who has, no back office that could help you protecting your communications, for instance, it's quite hard. So. What I do, if I can afford to, is when I go to a country where I would maybe face prosecution or where I might face trouble, I use a new computer. I use a Virgin-like telephone. I use different accounts on cloud accounts. I do everything from scratch. Sometimes I don't even say that I'm a journalist. Sometimes I'm a tourist, or I give some profession. I create a website that shows that I'm a consultant, for instance. So in order to protect myself, it really depends on which country I'm focusing. And there are some countries that I simply cannot travel to because they are organized, and if they see my passport and my name, they might suspect who I am, and they can arrest me. And today, you're easily a terrorist, You go and you report about some rebel movement somewhere. And of course, for the rebels, they are freedom fighters. And for the opposite side, they're terrorists. And then you go to another country, which is maybe allied to that first country. And they also consider you a terrorist. And you're not aware that they are allied and that they consider this specific rebel movement as a terrorist organization. And then you end up being in big, big trouble.
Yeah, I can only imagine. So what about, biometric passports and all that? Even if you have a different name, would they not recognize you? If you're being searched for by, let's say, a government institution or a department, would they not recognize you through your image in the passport?
Exactly, yeah. With the biometric passports, you're pretty lost. And my only choice is to avoid certain countries where I know that the authorities are looking for me or where I suspect it. So parts of the world have become no-go countries for me.
Yeah, I understand. I bet you are heavily relying on your contacts like in place in the country that you go to, how do you know who to trust?
Well, that's a matter of experience. And especially in the Middle East, where family ties are very important, I always try to find somebody, maybe a person that I've already known, and I'm looking for somebody of his family or her family who might be in that country of interest to me. I'm always trying to find another family member who could help me, because if the family member betrays me, he or she might be in trouble with the rest of the family because they know me. And this is a good way of dealing with Middle Eastern countries. So I usually, and that's the nice thing where I live, we have many diasporas from all over the world. So let's say if I want to go to Sri Lanka, there are lots of Tamils here, Sri Lankans here. So I would have to penetrate one of those families here. I would have to get their confidence, and I should have trust in them. And then they would give me a name, a number somewhere of a family member in India or in Sri Lanka, and they might help me with what I'm going to do in Sri Lanka. So this is usually the way forward. But sometimes I also use contacts that other journalists give me. So journalists are usually pretty helpful. All the war reporters know that they need to rely on information that they get from other journalists. So if somebody has a good fixer, a good driver in a country of interest, then they might share it with me. That's a second way of getting somebody who you can trust. But I also did things purely through the internet. So I once got to know a kind of human trafficker on Facebook, and he directed me to another human trafficker whom I needed to cross into a very difficult country. I mean, it was a fortified border, and I really needed some professional help. Of course, I had to pay that guy. Well, I ended up being in pretty good hands. I could trust that trafficker, and he brought me across the border, and then I came back through another way with another trafficker, but it worked out all fine. And actually, the original contact, I haven't met that person ever. I just talked to him on Facebook. That's another way, which is, of course, a bit more risky. And I took my precautions. When I met that real person, I really checked this guy up, and I realized, yeah, I think I can trust him.
Wow, that's very courageous, to say the least. Doesn't that make you nervous to even rely on third-party contacts and like a network of people that you might have never met before?
Yes, it was a special experience. But I mean, these are the nice things about the internet. I mean, if you get a contact like this, it's of course much more risky than anything else. But in that specific situation, I had the chance to test that person before it became earnest. So I really got the impression that there were refugees there from the country where the trafficker came from, and all those refugees, they knew this guy, and I could see that, and they trusted him. So he brought them safely over the border. I wanted to go the other way, so I trusted him in the end. Yes.
So do you have any idea what would happen if you were detected crossing a border that you were not supposed to, like from the government side or a militia or anything like that?
Well, it depends what militia or what country. So far, I have almost always been safe. I wasn't detected, but it's clear. For instance, if you try to cross the Turkish-Syrian border, that's a really fortified border now, and the Turkish soldiers they shoot at you. And they do this on a almost regular basis. They shoot on refugees. They shoot on terrorists who try to cross the border. I know journalists, friends of mine, who have been arrested and treated harshly. This is dangerous. I was once arrested in Africa in the middle of the desert when I was crossing a border illegally, and it was quite funny. they didn't have a prison there. I mean, it was really in the desert. So they just took away my passport and said, well, you can sleep here in the sand and tomorrow we'll talk. I mean, they caught me in the middle of the night. And then the next day we talked. They wanted to use my satellite phone to make private phone calls. In the end, we just agreed on a certain sum that had to be paid, and then they let me go. But it was not very nice to be arrested by such guys. You know, they
Yeah,
wore
of course.
uniforms, but you don't know to which side they belong, and that's
Mm.
really dangerous. I mean, if you say something wrong, and they are the wrong guys, maybe you haven't even
Mhm.
crossed the border, no, you're still in the country that you were supposed to leave, then you might end up in big trouble. So crossing borders, using human traffickers, trusting them or not trusting them, is a very important feature of my job.
Yeah, speaking of Syria, I think there is still an ongoing humanitarian crisis, and obviously the war is still ongoing, and there are many people who are vehemently opposed to grant Syrian refugees asylum, especially in European countries, but yet European governments at the same time don't intervene in Syria to kind of eventually resolve this devastating situation. Why is there such a lack of interest in the Syrian war and what is going on there?
Well, things have changed over the past few years. I mean, now the governments in Europe, they are mainly concerned with a pandemic. It's not only the European countries who don't want to accept the Syrian refugees. It's mainly the neighboring countries. I mean,
Mm.
Turkey closed its border, they built a wall. So it has become much more difficult for refugees to cross into Turkey and from there into Europe. So now on the way from Syria to Europe, there are several big impediments. It's not only the wall on the Turkish border, it's crossing into Greece or Bulgaria afterwards. And even if you manage to cross into Greece, you might end up as a refugee. You might end up on an island in a camp, which is not very nice. And from Greece to get into the EU proper, I mean, Greece is isolated within the EU. So if you want to travel by land, you have to cross the Balkans until you reach, let's say, Hungary. And even there, the border is fortified. So you find fortified borders along more or less all the way. So some refugees have resorted to taking boats, be it from Syria, be it from Turkey, and to sail directly to Italy, which is very dangerous and it's very costly. You need, of course, you need traffickers. So it's not only the policy of the European countries that are an impediment to refugees, but also the neighboring countries. Everybody has enough of the refugee problem in Syria. And of course, I mean, if you look at politics within Syria, the government has more or less won the war. They haven't got the control over whole of the country. They have huge economic problems. They have high inflation. Neighboring Lebanon has practically imploded, and Lebanon was always very, very important economically to Syria and especially to the regime, also to circumvent the sanctions against Syria. The situation within the country has changed dramatically. You still have terrorists, you still have the Islamic State, you have the autonomous, semi-autonomous regions in the north controlled by Kurdish militia. But I think the economic situation is so dire that you also have a lot of economic migrants from Syria. And well, they can't really move because the country is encircled. It's not easy to get outside. Yeah, maybe you can go to Iraq. That's not so difficult. But going to Jordan has a fortified border as well. Going to Lebanon is still possible, but how do you get from Lebanon to Europe? It's difficult and it needs a lot of money. So people in Syria are trapped.
That's terrible. What do you believe is the main issue nowadays? Is it Assad and the regime, or is it the jihadists in Syria?
It's definitely both, and it's the countries also behind those conflict sides, the Russians and the Iranians behind the regime, the Turks, especially behind the Islamists in the province of Idlib. The Islamic State is more or less free-floating, especially fighting the regime, but also the Kurds. I mean, they really try to liberate their prisoners in the Kurdish areas. They just attacked a town where a big prison was, and they killed a lot of people. It was one of the biggest attacks of the Islamic State since the fall of the caliphate. And it's really astonishing that this attack has seen almost no media reporting in the West. I mean, the Europeans are so preoccupied with themselves and their corona pandemic, they don't see the important stuff which is happening, let's say, in Ukraine. There might be, there's a looming war there, but also the Islamic State is getting back on its feet, not only in Iraq and Syria. Look at the countries in Africa. I mean, the Islamic State is in the Sahara, it's in Nigeria, it's in the east, at the banks of the Indian Ocean. They are in Mozambique. Mm-hmm. And so they are spreading. They got a beating in Syria and Iraq. And now they're just trying it somewhere else, also in Afghanistan. And at least when it comes to reporting, media are not taking any interest. They're just using cheap means to cover the corona pandemic. Well, I mean, you can do that from home, from your couch, with an internet connection. And right. So this is a very dangerous development, that journalists and media, they don't go out, they don't go to the place of interest anymore where things are happening. And this might change the way politicians think, because they don't realize what's really going on and what is really important.
Yeah, I also feel like during the pandemic now, the entire shift of the focus has changed, obviously, for some like partially understandable reasons. But then at the same time, if other countries are not preoccupied with their own issues, let's say, then they can put their focus towards crisis and all that. But, you know, with the refugee camps, there was a lot of reporting on that, like the fire in the refugee camp in Moria and so on. And there was a big outcry on social media, and then it was not spoken about anymore. So I find that really, difficult to see, actually.
Yeah. You know, the media, they are in economic problems, so they try to save money. And there is a way of doing cheap reports that you do from home, from your home office. Corona really has aggravated a situation that was there before, that journalists don't like to go out. They like it to do their job in a cheap way. And when it comes to foreign reporting or war reporting, which is always, it's dangerous, it's expensive, this is where media cut costs. And in the end, we have journalists who do the same job that you could do as a non-journalist just by watching Twitter and some channels on Telegram or whatever. It's not what journalists should do. Go there, talk to the people, find it out. You mentioned Moria, the refugee camp on the Greek island. You know, the media portrayed this as the big refugee camp crisis. There was a fire in a camp. The fire was lit by migrants themselves. And of course, it was a terrible thing. But this is not the refugee crisis. The refugees, they come from Syria, they come from Iraq, they come from Afghanistan. I mean, that's the hot points of the refugee crisis, not some refugee camp in the European Union. And it's so ridiculous that journalists portrayed this as the big problem. Of course, Greece, they have a problem with all those migrants, and they're left alone by the other European countries who originally promised to take some of those refugees to ease the burden on the Greece government. And when the Europeans didn't do what they promised, well, the Greeks said, well, we can't shoulder this alone. So they didn't have an interest in protecting the camps properly and spend a lot of money on it. So that's the reason for the dire situation in those camps. But if you compare any Greek refugee camp to the camps in the Syrian province of Idlib, it's a huge difference. I mean, there are no bombs exploding in Greece, in Greek refugee camps. But in Idlib, bombs are exploding, artillery shells are landing somewhere. The media really portrayed this in a almost like a propagandist way. they created something, they can maybe change the situation in EU countries, but by not talking about the real issues and why the refugees came to Greece in the first place, they are forgetting about conflicts like the one in Syria or with the Islamic State in Iraq, Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. And I think that's a big problem for the West. We don't really see the real problems.
I think there's in Syria, speaking of which, there is almost like a war by proxy being fought out on all kinds of different sides. There are so many different like parties involved. What do you think could the Western world do to help with the situation?
Well, it has become very difficult because if you channel aid to Syria, you're only allowed to do this through the regime, and the regime takes its cut, and the regime makes sure that the other side doesn't get anything of that help or only gets a very small amount. And so any aid given to a country like Syria risks being an aid to one of the conflict parties, which is the regime. And the regime has shown during the last more than 10 years that it doesn't care for its own population, and that it is the real issue behind the migrant crisis in the Middle East. Afghanistan is a new thing, and it's far away, but the Syrians are much closer, and millions made it already to Turkey and to Western Europe. The people, the Syrians, they fled from the war or from the Islamists, from the terrorists, true, but the majority fled because of the actions of the regime, the bombing of the towns, the artillery shelling, the massacres, not only made by Islamists, but mainly done by the army and government militia. Now people are talking about how can they help Syria, and they end up helping the regime, which is the reason for all the trouble that we have. I don't see any way out. It's not easy anymore. It was never easy, but since the Russians came to Syria in 2015, it has become almost impossible because all military action now in Syria could provoke the Russians in hitting back. I mean, the Americans, they have to deal with this every day in Syria with their planes, with the movements in the northeast, in the Kurdish territory, even in the southeast of Syria, there are some American troops, and they have to be careful not to get into conflict with the Russian soldiers who are also in Syria. So I think maybe the problem will solve itself by the bankruptcy of the regime. But then there is Iran behind the regime. They have oil, they have money, and they can't afford to lose the regime, because otherwise they wouldn't be in a position to supply Hezbollah in South Lebanon. And that's the strategy of Iran. I mean, they want to be a threat to Israel, and they can't do this without Hezbollah and at least the south of Syria. So I don't see any way out for the time being.
Yeah, it's scary to think that these forces that are behind it have vast resources, financial, weapons, and so on, and also military personnel. So if you have the military who is working for the Assad regime, but like actually beneath their uniform, they're still civilians at the end of the day, are they fighting against their own family members eventually?
Well, I would say most families in Syria, they are split into people who like the government and into people who like the opposition, the armed opposition. So, you're talking about an army, but the Syrian army has more or less vanished. It's still there on paper, and of course they're wearing uniforms, they have planes, they have tanks, but in the end it's warlords with militia. And if the regime wants to start the big offensive, the regime has to talk to all these warlords and has to offer them something in return for their participation in the offensive. What they have to offer, I mean, the regime has no more money, so they give them the right to exploit a certain area. You get a province or you get a town, and then you have your roadblocks, and that's where you make the money with the civilians. And each lorry that passes with goods, it's like a border within the country. Maybe the Middle Ages in Europe is a comparison where you had all those, well, we didn't call them warlords at the time, but in fact it's the same thing. They are just taxing goods and services on those roadblocks, and if they like a woman, I mean, they take it out of her car, arrest her, rape her, and do whatever they want. And of course, on the other side, it's a bit similar, except for maybe the Kurdish areas that are more organized, but also in Idlib, you have these roadblocks, you need to pay. Those warlords, they make money from the war. They have no interest in stopping it. And the longer such a war lasts, it becomes more and much more difficult to end it, because there are so many people that are earning their living. It's nice to be a soldier on a roadblock. You have a Kalashnikov, you don't have to work. If you like a woman, you just take her out of her car, you tax the goods, you ask for bribes, you have a nice life.
Sounds like anarchy to me.
It's a kind of anarchy. I mean, anarchy doesn't really exist in the world. I mean, it's always the right of the guy who has more weapons, who has the Kalashnikov. You're just a traveler, you have nothing, and then you have to do whatever they ask you for. I mean, it's a situation that large parts of Africa have experienced for decades maybe. And for Syria, this is something, I mean, it developed during the last 10 years. And it's very hard to see how to get rid of this.
Do you actually agree with that statement that this is a war by proxy? And if so, why do you think what the motivation is behind Russian and American involvement in this? Is it due to Cold War sentiments?
Well, it's different maybe for each actor. It's not only a war by proxy. I mean, it's a real civil war. There are warring sides with different diverging interests, but these conflict parties, they would be nothing without the foreign support. And the Islamists, the former Free Syrian Army, which were not Islamists, at least not at the beginning of the war, they got a lot of help from Arab countries like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and other countries. But with the intervention of the Russians in 2015, they sooner or later abandoned their proxies. So the remaining Islamists, apart from the Islamic State, which is, well, you could say free floating, they get their money. I mean, they are kidnapping, they're trying to fight on. But the big conflict parties opposed to the government are those rebels and Islamists in Idlib. They are the proxy of Turkey. That's obvious. And then you have the Kurds in the northeast, who are kind of proxy of the Americans. The Americans have their interest there, but the Americans are there because they don't want to leave Syria completely to the Russians. And where the Kurds are, there is the oil in Syria. So they're also protecting the oil fields, which are now used by the Kurds, which is in fact the PKK. The PKK is behind the Kurdish militias in northeastern Syria. And so it's funneling money to the PKK. It's the same money that before and during the caliphate, it went to the Islamic State. And now the Kurds took over the oil fields from the Islamic State with the help of the Americans. And so now they are getting the money. But still, the Kurds are obliged to talk to the regime and to sell their oil to the regime, because the oil fields are under their control, but the refineries are under government control. So this is a situation that hasn't changed since the caliphate. The Islamic State was obliged to sell its oil also to the regime. The regime was obliged to buy the oil from the Islamic State. And now the Islamic State has lost, well, the big war. They're still fighting a small war. And the Kurds took over the oil fields. So it's a giving and taking. It's not only a proxy war. Now, when it comes to the Russians, I think they just realized that before they invaded Syria in 2015, they realized that the Americans are very weak. Obama was a weak president when it came to foreign policy. And Putin realized that he can do something there. He can get back a little bit of the Russian reputation as a world power. And you remember shortly after they did the deal with Obama about the chemical weapons in Syria, Putin invaded Crimea and took over this peninsula from Ukraine. So the Syrian situation was like a testing field for Putin. What would the Americans do? Where are their red lines? Would they fight back? And I think that hasn't changed that much. The Americans made it clear they won't accept any intervention inside the Kurdish areas in the northeast for the time being. But these Kurdish areas are under attack from the north by Turkey and by the Islamic State and by the regime. The regime is not trying to do too much because they fear American air power, but they wait until maybe the Turks will do something. So it's a very complicated situation, and you have shifting alliances. It's very hard to understand what's going on, and I think even the Americans, they don't know what is really going on the ground.
The official numbers show that only 1.14% of the territory is under control of the Islamic State. Does that number reflect what you know?
Well, the Islamic State is now fighting a guerrilla war. I mean, they're attacking here and there, then they retreat. Of course, they have their places in the Syrian desert and also on the Iraqi side in the desert, and sometimes in the mountains they have their positions. But it's not like before when they were really trying to hold on to towns. They are constantly moving, and that's why it's difficult to hit them. So the area they control doesn't really say much about their military strength. But what is obvious is that since their defeat, they have rebuilt parts of their capabilities, and the attack on Hasaka just recently, the last few days, has shown that they are able to attack towns even if they are defended by tanks, helicopters, drones. And they managed to penetrate the big prison there where the Kurds keep the ISIS and the IS prisoners. I think they even liberated some of the inmates. I think it's really changing. I mean, before they were not able to do such big attacks in Syria, and now they're showing that they are capable, and this is a very dangerous development.
Are the IS still recruiting for new people to join them? And is that actually happening, or are people not joining anymore as much?
Well, there are still people who are disappointed by politics, let's say, in Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a Sunni Iraqi, then you're a minority within Shia-dominated Iraq. I don't think you will get a good government job. You will not be part of the army. You will not be an officer in the army. So many Sunnis still are disappointed. It's the same thing. It has been the same thing since the downfall of Saddam Hussein. So, of course, IS can recruit there. They are recruiting a few foreigners, but most foreigners who want to join the IS now, they are not going to Syria or Iraq. They are going somewhere else, or they're trying to build up something in their own countries, like in African countries. So when the Islamic State comes under pressure in one part of the world, they're trying to compensate by increasing their activities in other parts of the world. And these other parts of the world have been Africa and Afghanistan, to a certain extent also the Philippines in the last few years. But now it seems that they are getting some more strength in Syria and Iraq. And you see, the Islamic State is taking advantage of the political situation. There is no political situation to the problems in Syria. I mean, the regime is holding on to power. There is no solution in Iraq. You don't have Kurdish independence in the north. The Sunni are still a minority that is scared by the Shia majority. The Shia majority is more or less ruled by Iran, which is also a Shia country. So there are no political solutions. And if there are no political solutions, people resort to violence and to weapons. This has been the situation for some years now. And unless there is a political solution in those countries, the war will go on, and terrorist movements like the Islamic State and others will thrive.
How have you witnessed or experienced people that are still stuck or remain in Syria? How are they living through this?
Well, it's very frustrating for them. I mean, it's very cold now. They also have a corona pandemic, but we're not talking about this. One of
Right.
my friend, his father is still in Syria, or he was still in Syria. He attracted corona, and they wanted to bring him to a hospital. So it was his brother who brought him to a hospital, but they wouldn't find any medicine. So the father died, and the brother contracted corona, and a few weeks later he died as well. So things are really terrible, but nobody's speaking about it. We are speaking about our problems, me Too problems, gender language, inclusion, and we think these are big problems here. But in fact, we have forgotten about the rest of the world and the suffering there. We are talking about the problems of the pandemic here in our developed countries, and we completely ignore what's going on elsewhere.
It was interesting for me to see how the reporting on the situation in Afghanistan developed. What do you personally think about that they have been withdrawn? Is that just because Trump had originally promised to actually make that move and Biden had to go through with it?
I'm not an expert on Afghanistan anymore.
Mm.
It's been a long time since I've been in Afghanistan. I think the retreat was inevitable, but I mean, the way it was organized was a catastrophe. And that's actually not Trump's fault. That was Biden's fault. He could have done it differently, but he decided that, well, it's the same problem all the time in wars. If politicians make the deadlines, decide about the deadlines, and the generals have to follow suit, then disaster looms. I think if the generals would have had their way, they would have drawn out that retreat, and it would have been less severe. But in the end, for the population, and the population is only 50% female, it's not only the females who are suffering under Taliban rule, and so it's terrible for the whole population. And this is being ignored. We are just talking about those the translators with the American soldiers or the British or the Germans, which is it's a serious issue. No, you cannot rely on people for years to translate, to help you with your war effort, and then abandon them from one day to another. That's a very bad strategy. Nobody will ever help you again if you come to those countries. And I think the Americans will realize later on what blunder they did in Afghanistan. But it's a matter about the whole population now. I mean, there is no economy. The Taliban don't know how to lead a country. What are they going to do? I mean, what can they produce in Afghanistan? I think it's only drugs. And people will suffer. People are going hungry. And the Taliban are using this to blackmail the West. And the West, in the end, will give maybe billions in aid to a regime that they have been fighting for 20 years. I mean, it's absurd. And I don't see a solution to that either. The only thing that I'm quite sure, I mean, at the beginning of the crisis, people thought that Afghan refugees will arrive quickly in Europe. But because, the border fortifications of the Turks, especially also on the Iranian border, I think this will take a long time until a huge influx of Afghans will reach Europe. They are already reaching Europe, but in smaller numbers, and they're mainly those people who had already been in Iran for many years as refugees, as Afghan refugees. But I don't know how long it will take until hundreds, thousands or millions of Afghans will finally find the way to Europe. The way they used, through Belarus, it just shows that the direct way through Turkey has become so difficult for migrants to cross those borders. So they're looking for other ways. And of course, the traffickers, they're also looking for other ways to bring their clients to Europe and make a lot of money out of it.
What do you think should have been done differently with the retreat in Afghanistan?
Well, it's always easy to be more clever after things happen. But I think the problem if politicians try to solve military problems, a retreat on this scale should have been taking more time and more preparation and maybe also more political talks. Maybe it would have been possible to bring the Taliban to, well, they brought them to the negotiating table, but the Taliban knew that the Americans want to leave. So why should they compromise? I think one of the main mistakes was that Trump already said so clearly that they will take back their soldiers from Afghanistan. And so he lost all bargaining power with the Taliban. But doing it so quickly as Biden did it, that was definitely a mistake.
Is there any way citizens can maybe have a chance to reduce the influence of the Taliban?
It's difficult to say, but there is still resistance to Taliban rule, armed resistance and peaceful one. We tend to look at the situation merely through the lens of women's rights and LGBTQI. But this is not how Afghans look at their society. Before the first fall of the Taliban, after 9/11, women in Afghanistan have always worn the burqa, at least in the countryside. When I was in Afghanistan, I never saw a woman without a burqa. And that's, at least for the country, the population in the countryside, for the peasants, for the simple people, this is their normal life. We might not like it, of course, but they are used to this. So Taliban rule now is hard for the people in the big cities where women enjoyed certain rights when the Americans still were in power or in indirect power. For the much larger population that lives in the countryside, this is not the real issue. The real issue is that they are going hungry, and that concerns everybody, not just women. And a government that cannot provide for its own people is doomed to fail. So it's really the question: how will the Taliban sort out their economic problems? How will they feed the hungry? Will they simply leave them to starve? What will the West do? What will the neighboring countries do? It's very difficult to say anything about the future, but it's definitely not only the issue of women's rights. They are important, but in a country like Afghanistan, I mean, they have more pressing needs, like getting food on the table. And I think that's the big issue now.
So you are also reporting on extremism and terrorism. Can you tell me, is there still a threat to young Muslims in other countries to be indoctrinated into like extremist ideologies?
Yes, of course, there are. But the fall of the caliphate has affected Muslims worldwide. I mean, the attractiveness, the lure of the Islamic State has lost much of its force that it had before. In 2014, when the caliphate was founded, I mean, this was a huge magnet to Muslim youth all over the world. And thousands and thousands wanted to go to Syria to join the caliphate. This is different now. And the Islamic State hasn't been very active on the terrorist level of its war. I mean, they have been busy with their prisoners in Syria mainly. They want to liberate those prisoners, and that's the priority right now. And that might be a reason why there haven't been so many terrorist attacks, because they were really trying to collect money in Western countries and elsewhere to liberate the prisoners, to pay traffickers who could smuggle them out of the camps, or to pay for all the weapons and the means that they are needing to attack prisons and liberate the inmates. And we are still in the middle of that, because thousands of important IS personnel are in those prisons in Syria and also in Iraq. And I think the priority is to get them out, and we will see if they manage or if they fail.
Speaking of extremism, people who aren't part of like either extreme side or might be of a multicultural background or a part of, a minority group are at risk, because I feel like they are sort of trapped in between like the extreme right, like maybe neo-Nazi groups, and then also Islamist terrorist group. What do you believe is a bigger threat to, like, let's say, Western countries at the moment?
I think the corona pandemic has given a lot of strength to right extremist groups.
Hmm.
I think that's pretty obvious, but it doesn't mean yet that they will resort to violence. But we know that in Germany, but also in the US, there is a problem with right-wing terrorism as well. I say as well because the threat by Islamic terrorists is still looming. It's not the same as it was in 2015 and maybe shortly after that, but it's still there. And if the Islamic State gets on its feet in the Middle East again, or in other countries, and finds new um, sources of revenue, then Islamic terrorism might come back. But I wouldn't be able to say which form of terrorism, right-wing terrorism or Islamist terrorism, is the bigger threat now. I think it very much depends about which country we are talking. I believe, for instance, in France, the Islamist threat is much bigger than the right-wing threat. It might be different in Germany. I mean, there the intelligence service says, well, the threat from the right wing side is bigger, and then we tend to forget that there is a left wing terrorism as well, and actually they're not placing bombs in supermarkets or railway stations, but there is a threat that they are resorting to violence, and they're actually resorting to low-level violence. I mean, they're usually not attacking people, but they're attacking, well, houses. You can't really compare it to Islamist terrorism, but there is
Mm.
a tendency to violence also on the left-wing side, and some intelligence people are very worried about that. About this development on the left-wing side. But I would say, in general, the threat is still the biggest, be it Al-Qaeda, be it IS, and a second place is for right-wing extremists.
Mm. As you've mentioned, Germany actually has, amongst some other countries, has a specific department to like observe potential threats to society, and that is called, sort of translated, the Department of Defense of the Constitution. What I find astonishing about it is that there are countries who don't have such an institution or department to screen for like potential threats. Do you think that is due to an unwillingness to come to realize that this is a necessity?
Well, I would say most countries do have an intelligence service, and
Hmm.
it's just the name that the Germans gave it to their, how do you say, the interior intelligence service. I mean,
Hmm.
as opposed to the external one. I mean, the Americans have the CIA for external operation, and they have the FBI for internal ones.
Right.
And in Germany, they just call it Verfassungsschutz, the service to protect the constitution. That is a
Hmm.
legacy of the Second World War, of course. But all intelligence services in Europe, and I guess in many other countries as well, they are focusing on terrorist threats today. That's very, very obvious. And one has to admit, I mean, they have been very successful since 2015 in, well, there haven't been too many terrorist attacks, especially not no big ones like Bataclan in Paris 2015 or 9/11. I mean, there have been terrorist attacks, but most of them were not very big ones, at least not in Europe. It's different in Arab countries, in African countries, in Asia. But I don't think that the way the intelligence services work is so different in different Western countries. And they do cooperate very well, at least within the Western alliance. The intelligence services are cooperating, and they prevented many terrorist attacks.
Actually, speaking of prevention of terrorist attacks, I find that a very interesting topic generally. But then what comes to mind to me personally is racial profiling by law enforcement. And I do feel that is increasingly of concern to especially minorities. What do you think could be done, protecting society at large and still not profiling minorities or people who look differently, quote unquote?
Well, that's a very difficult topic.
Mm.
Racial profiling doesn't only happen because of a terrorist threat. Sometimes it has to do with petty crime. There are many reasons for it. But of course, if you're fighting Islamist terrorism, there is no sense in searching a church. It's obvious that you have to focus on Muslims. And it's hard to find those, 0.1% of all Muslims who might be ready to engage in violent activities against non-Muslims. I mean, it's a very, very small minority of all Muslims that are supporting Islamist terror groups. And of course, you have to focus on the Muslim minorities in the West, but you shouldn't make the huge majority of Muslims who don't want to hurt non-Muslims, you shouldn't make themselves your enemy. On the contrary, you should convince them of democracy, and you should convince them of the fight against the extremists among themselves. And that's a very, very difficult path to take. On one hand, you have to be aggressive against those who are really violent, but you shouldn't make the huge majority your enemy. And it's not only a thing of racial profiling, it's a way of clever engaging a minority. Make them the winners of the fight against terrorism instead of the losers. Try to convince them to fight together against those extremists. Because it's worldwide, it's still the Muslims who suffer most under Islamic terrorism. It's not the Western countries, it's not the Christians, it's Muslims who suffer under Muslim extremism.
Mm. Do you have an opinion on the fact that I feel like a lot of governments, especially in Europe, are heavily underestimating the threat or gaining power of right-wing extremists? What do you think of that? Why that is?
I think that has changed quite dramatically. I mean, in Germany, it has been obvious for a long time that the right-wing terrorism is on the rise. In the UK, for quite some time, the intelligence services have warned about right-wing terrorism. Also in the US, they have realized that they have a rather pronounced problem of homegrown terrorism on the right-wing side. And other countries like France, they clearly see Islamic terrorism as the main threat. But most countries have been aware that there is also another kind of terrorism looming.
All right. So I don't want to keep you much longer. Lastly, I would like to ask you, how are you dealing with everything that you have seen and witnessed and experienced, especially in these war zones?
Well, talking about it helps, whether it's to a therapist or to my kids who are quite big now. They can understand a little bit what I've seen, what my hopes are, my fears are, but also writing or filming and publishing my thoughts. All of this helps. But at the same time, as journalists, we are part of the media, and the media is at least the traditional media is a shrinking business, as opposed to all the social media where you have all those funny conspiracy theories and strange things happening there. So we do have a problem as journalists, especially if you do expensive journalism like traveling, going to war zones. That has become much more difficult and much more dangerous because the funds are not there anymore. It's really hard to buy you protection because media don't have the money anymore, unless maybe the real big TV chains. So this is a rather frustrating experience, and I don't know how I'm going to cope with that. The future will tell.
Well, I believe it is crucial and very, very much underestimated to hear reporters' opinions because sometimes they have to be left out to sort of report hard facts, but I think that human nuance adds a lot to the story and to our understanding of situations. So thank you very much for being here, Kay, and for your insights and your time.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. For me too. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Upfront Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss out on any new episodes. We will be back next week.